Thanks for tuning in to podcast number 35. Once again, I appreciate everybody taking the time to listen to these and to write in and all the messages. Sometimes it does take me a while to answer all of them, but I do answer all of them. And here we're coming up into the off season, and I do have quite the list of off season podcasts to go over. So we will be doing some things on fitness series. And also we're going to start doing some stuff on some bike prep and talking about bikes a little bit more, because that is part of the gearhead in me that likes to talk about that stuff. So you will see some stuff on the motorcycle, the actual motorcycle end of it instead of the riding end of it, since I do get pretty involved with that as well. Once again, I do appreciate all the donations. And the last podcast we had 34. Wow, the response from that one has been absolutely phenomenal. So here we go, podcast number 35. And this podcast is another podcast that was basically a request podcast. And I had quite a few people ask me, oh, what's the difference between riding a small bike and a big bike? Or should I get a big bike or should I get a small bike? Or which one should I get, or whatever the issue is. And I'm going to answer that in a bunch of different ways. And my thought process on some of the small bikes is actually changed over the last couple of years. And when I say small bikes, I'm a huge fan of like the SV650 or those 650 type of bikes. Now that we're starting to get some of the 300s into play, KTM bikes, and I've worked with a lot of the KTM riders, Anthony Amasiato, Gage McAllister, guys like that. So I've worked with a lot of those riders, and of course the Moto2 stuff as well. So the Ninja 250 style bike, honestly, I was not a fan of that bike. And I wasn't a fan of that bike because it was so dang slow. And to really race that bike properly, you had to kind of do things that weren't really, be honest, safe, right? They're so slow that where do you make up all the time? Well, in the corners. Where's all the risk, right? In the corners. And then, the argument would be, well, gosh, small bikes, you're not a fan of small bikes, but, riding one of these is like riding a Moto3 bike. Yeah, no, it's not. Those bikes are so much faster. They handle so much better. So not only until now that we've gotten into the KTM bike, the R3, the new Ninja 300 bikes like that, they make just enough torque now, right? They make just enough torque to where you can actually start riding them properly. And again, the technique's the same, just the degree of application changes. And I've spent a lot of time on those bikes the last year, this last year especially. I've been doing a bunch of fun stuff on the R3s as well as some of the Ninja 300s. I'm having a blast on them. And then actually had a pretty fun test on where we did a comparison of a KTM, stock KTM versus a stock R3 with some data acquisition. So that was very fun, and we should probably make a podcast out of that one at some point. So let's just get into it, right? So what it boils down to, riding a small bike to a big bike, it's force and time. Force and time. The big bike has a lot more acceleration force. It has a lot more braking force and time. When you start looking at things as a track, as instead of looking at it as time or speed, look at it as time. Think about it as feet per second. And to put that really into play, I did some math, and I can do a little bit of math. Let's take our wonderful feet per second deal here. So a couple of the tracks that I visited this summer, Miller or UMC, and PIR, right? Super long straightaways. Well, an R3 will do 105 miles an hour, something like that. And let's just take an R1, hypothetical R1 might do 175 miles an hour. A little bit more, a little bit less, but we'll just use 175. So at 100 miles an hour, that's about 150 feet a second. 150 feet a second. R1 at 175 miles an hour, 256 feet a second. So not only are you going 150 plus feet, 100 and some odd feet more a second, you've got more force, right? The bike weighs more as well. So you're stopping more mass and you're trying to accelerate more mass as well. So think about it that way, right? And that really is one of the big processes when people go from a small bike to a big bike, is that their brain literally can't process the speed. So force and time, that's really what it is. The small bikes, they give you time to think, right? You go down a straightaway and you've got time to actually process what's going on. You're coming up to a corner, you got time to process what's going on. You have time to be proactive. On the bigger bikes, things are happening so much faster with so much force. You have so much less time to think about it. And that's where part of the things that we work on, oh, that's right, podcast 34, working on your mental game, right, is learning how to speed up your thought process, right? Learning how to be in a position to control your thoughts. And that is something that I actually am working on some clients with in the off season, is we're actually working on some fun little mind games to try to speed up their brain processing. So smaller bikes give you time to think. Big bikes, not so much, right? You've really got to be on your game and be completely focused on that. And the fundamentals are the fundamentals, right? So it doesn't matter. I was watching Moto World Championship qualifying today, and watching Moto 3 and watching MotoGP. And when you look at the corners that they use the brakes, right? Because we have some of the corners on the Moto 3 bikes, they're going to be wide open through that. Obviously, the MotoGP bikes will either break through or roll off through or have to decelerate at some point for. Is those bikes, if they use the brakes, first of all, they're going to turn in with them, right? That's the bottom line. But where they're using the brakes, I watched 2 or 3 different corners. Where they let off the brakes from the Moto 3 bike to the MotoGP bike was virtually the same. Yeah, give or take a few feet. But the slowest point of the corner is the slowest point of the corner. And it didn't matter on those corners where they had to use the brakes. So that still stayed relatively the same. So the fundamentals are the fundamentals. The thing about the small bikes that's interesting is that when you have less force, right, the bike doesn't make as much power, and you have more time, it's really easy to get sloppy. It doesn't really matter that much. I've worked with riders that they on the Ninja bikes, and they'll say, oh, well, God, apexes really don't matter. It's such a small bike. Well, of course they matter. The faster you go, the more it matters. Having ridden some of these bikes at a very high pace, you absolutely need to have your crap together. So yeah, you can say that, but as your pace comes up, as the risk level comes up, you absolutely positively need to be precise. So the fundamentals are the fundamentals. And, the big bikes, you have to be more precise. That's all there is to it. There's more at stake. It matters more. A quarter throttle on a Ninja 300 might be 12 horsepower. Quarter throttle on an R1, might be 65 horsepower. So thinking about it that way. And, staying on that vein a little bit about what it used to be like with the smaller bikes, we also didn't have the advances with the big bikes that we do nowadays. Before we had electronics, and even some of the fuel injection tuning wasn't as advanced as it is now. And here we can take a very, very powerful bike and we can basically change the throttle map as well, right? So even though we're changing the fueling map, we can change the throttle opening map as well. And I've been in some very, very powerful bikes. I rode a very, very powerful ZX10 this week at Chuckwalla, and then we had some changes to the throttle map, right? So we could get the throttle to not use as much power down low because the bike was so crazy fast, over 200 horsepower. So we have all these different advances of the bikes that are going on to help tailor them for us. So the real question of all this is, now that I blab forever, is nuances. So what are some of the nuances, right? Basically, the nuances are turn-in points, apexes, brakes, and actually some of the acceleration, things like that. So turn-in points. Think about it this way. Again, it's time. So the faster you go, the earlier your actions have to start. The earlier your actions have to start, the earlier your turn-in has to happen, right? The sooner you have to go to the brakes. So the small bikes, they're going to turn in later than a big bike, right? They're traveling in the same distance in more time, so they can delay it, and of course they're going slower. So the turn-in points on a small bike are later. Apexes, there's still an apex, yes. There's still a slow point of the corner, yes. Slow point of the corner is slightly earlier, just as the apex is slightly earlier. And we're talking feet, right? We're not talking 40 feet or something along those lines. It's slightly earlier. So if people that have ridden with us at the Yamaha school, ridden us at the Rick days or whatever, we've used the double apex cones. And up with those cones is we'll apex slightly closer to the first apex cone than will the second apex cone. And it's that way because the bike's got less force, right? It takes more time for the bike to get out to the edge of the track. So you can accelerate a little bit earlier on those bikes. And of course, it just doesn't have as much force either. So turn-in points are a little bit later on the small bike. Apexes are a little bit earlier on the small bike. So a little bit of a different thought process there. Braking. The bottom line with brakes, we'll talk about that a little bit because, people say, oh, I'm riding a small bike. Man, I've been told never to use the brakes on a small bike. Well, you know what? On entry corners, you're going to suck. That's all there is to it. Yeah. And the way it works is, okay, let's just take a corner where you think you can go on a small bike, you think you can go wide open throttle through. So you get in the corner, and you know what? If you can make it through the corner wide open and still hit your apex, and when I mean hit your apex, I mean add lean angle in, taking away lean angle coming out, you're good. Fantastic. Awesome. If you have to roll off the throttle, to do it, so in other words, if you can't make your apex, if you're full throttle, now you can't make your apex, and you have to roll off, man, almost guaranteed, depending on the radius of the corner, of course, that it's more efficient to use the brake. So, and think of the brakes then more as a geometry control rather than a speed control. There's a couple corners where I've ridden with some very, very quick small bike riders, and they say, oh gosh, yeah, I never used the brakes there. Well, I'll use the brakes in some of these particular corners because I'll accelerate longer. I'll get the bike slowed and pointed in less time and distance with the brake, and I'm back to wide open throttle sooner than they were. And of course, I'm doing it with less lean angle. So that works out really well. So on the brakes, if it's a corner that you have to, decelerate for, so if you have to decelerate for the corner, more than likely, let's try some brake. And if you're going to use the brakes, we're certainly going to turn in with them as well. But we'll give you some points there. And, what really also matters it's funny because acceleration matters more on the small bikes than it does the big bikes. If you're riding one of these small bikes, I would kill to be on the gas. I'd kill to be wide open throttle, 3 feet before the guy in front of me. I'd do anything for that. Big bikes, you can be pretty sloppy, right? Because usually the rider maybe is not running the highest pace. Your bike maybe be a little bit quicker, maybe a little bit slower, whatever it may be. But you don't have to be as precise as you do on the small bikes. The small bikes, you have to be a lot more precise. And man, I would kill to be, like I said, on the throttle 3 feet before the guy in front of me if I'm racing him. So acceleration actually matters more on the small bikes. So again, when you don't have as much risk, in other words, you don't have as much force in the bike, you don't have as much speed, you don't have to be as precise. Those bikes, great beginner bikes, they're great to get started into the sport. But as you get going at speed, let's be very clear. The faster you go on those bikes, the more precise you have to be, the more diligent, respectful, and all that. It all ends up being the same. Big bikes, man, you have got to be big bikes, bike placement, the discipline, they all matter more on the big bike, right? Because there's so much more speed and there's so much more force that's going there. So those are some of the nuances on those bikes. Super fun on the small bikes. Cost of ownership is also a blast. I know the R3 that we've ridden at the Rick days, I think we used the same set of tires for about 6 months and just had a blast. Everybody rode the bike and had just so much fun on all the days. And I think the tires lasted forever on it. They still gripped. We felt guilty, so they got taken off. Setup is not as big a deal, right? The bike doesn't have as much force. And yeah, I mean, fork springs are going to make a difference. As a matter of fact, the R3 that we ride at the Rick days has got a set of fork spring spacers in it, stock shock even, and the thing works great. I know Shane has gotten within a couple seconds or a second of some of the track, little production bike track records with just that setup. Then it works really, really well. And you don't have to have that crazy big setup in the thing because, again, the bike just doesn't have as much force into it. I did spend some time doing a bunch of setup work on some R3s this summer. And yes, they did end up working nice. Yes, we did go quicker on it, but it wasn't all that much quicker. And it was more of a comfort issue and a safety issue rather than it was an overall speed issue. So setup's a lot easier on those bikes. Again, there's just not as much force into them. So there you go. Difference between a big bike and a small bike. A lot of it is the fun factor, the cost factor. Of course, you get two people on R3s and it's a race. That's how that works. I'm a fan of pretty much anything with two wheels that goes. But riding the small bike, I think that'll give you some insight of what some of the differences are. Realizing that fundamentals are the fundamentals, right? It's all the same. It all matters. It all matters. When you're not going quick, it doesn't matter as much. When you're going quicker, all these things absolutely matter. The precision, the body position, all those things absolutely matter more when you're doing them. But getting started, the small bikes work great.